Before I begin, if you've ever lived through a quiet ending that changed everything, please leave a comment, and subscribe to Narrative Nest. I still remember the sound of the grocery store doors that night, the way they sighed open, letting in a breath of winter so sharp it made my eyes water. It was late December, the kind of evening where the cold felt personal, like it had followed you inside just to make a point. I was tired in the ordinary way: work, dinner plans, the mental list of things I'd forgotten at home. And I stood in line clutching a basket with soup, bread, and a box of tea I didn't really need. She was in front of me, an older woman, maybe late 60s, wrapped in a coat that had seen better winters. Her hair was pulled back tight, gray streaked with a yellowish white that reminded me of snow that's been walked on too much. She had a cart full of basics: canned beans, rice, a loaf of discount bread, powdered milk, the kind of groceries you buy when you're counting days as carefully as dollars. When the cashier announced the total, the woman nodded and slid a card forward. The machine beeped once, then again. The cashier tried a second time, her smile tightening like a knot pulled too hard. Declined. The woman didn't look surprised. She didn't argue or sigh. She just stared at the screen as if she'd already known how the conversation would end. I felt something move in my chest then. Not pity exactly. Recognition. I've been fortunate most of my life, but I know the feeling of standing at a counter hoping the world doesn't notice you're about to come up short. Before I could overthink it, I stepped forward and said, "I've got it." The woman turned to look at me for the first time. Her eyes were sharp and oddly bright, like they reflected more than the fluorescent lights overhead. For a moment, I wondered if I'd offended her, but she said nothing, just nodded once as the cashier rang everything through again under my total. When I handed over my card, my hands were steady. It wasn't a huge amount. I remember thinking I'd feel good about it later, that I'd go home and tell my husband, and we'd both agree it was the right thing to do, the small kindness you're supposed to be proud of. As we walked toward the exit together, the automatic doors opening like a mouth exhaling frost, she finally spoke. Her voice was low and rough, like it had been scraped against silence for too long. "When your husband leaves, don't touch the snow in your yard." She didn't say thank you. She didn't even look at me when she said it. She just adjusted her coat, pushed her cart into the night parking lot, and disappeared into the dark parking lot where the lamps buzzed like tired insects. I stood there long after the doors closed, the sentence hanging in the air between the smell of detergent and stale bread. When your husband leaves, not if, when. I remember laughing under my breath, a quick sound meant to brush the chill off my spine. People say strange things. Maybe she'd mistaken me for someone else. Maybe she talked like that to everyone she helped. At home, I told my husband about it while we ate soup at the kitchen table. He shook his head and smiled the way he always did when he thought something was silly but didn't want to argue. "Sounds like she watches too much TV," he said. We laughed, and the moment folded itself away into the category of odd stories you tell at dinner parties. Winter deepened. Snow came in thick, patient waves. Our yard filled and emptied with footprints, mine, his, the mail carrier's, until everything blended into that grayish white that means life is still happening underneath. If I thought about the woman at all, it was only in passing, the way you remember a dream after waking and then forget it by lunchtime. Our marriage didn't end with shouting or slammed doors. It ended the way a song fades out when you're not paying attention. Little silences where conversations used to be. His phone face down more often. A softness between us that thinned until it felt like air. We still said goodnight. We still asked about each other's days. But there was a distance that grew so gradually I couldn't tell you when it began. The morning he left, it was quiet enough to hear the house settle. No note on the counter, no argument. His side of the closet half empty, the hangers swinging gently like they weren't sure what to do with themselves. I stood in the doorway with my robe pulled tight, listening to the echo of his absence, and felt something inside me shift, like a wall moved in the dark. It wasn't until I stepped outside that the sentence came back to me. The snow in our front yard was untouched, perfect, a smooth, unbroken field from the porch to the sidewalk. Everywhere else on the street showed signs of life: children's boots, tire tracks, the churned mess of people coming and going. But at the edge of our property, the footprints stopped, cleanly, as if someone had reached an invisible line and decided not to cross. I stood there, keys in my hand, my breath fogging the air. For a moment, I thought it was a trick of the light. I stepped closer. The snow held its shape, flawless and deep as if it had fallen seconds ago. I remembered her voice then. When your husband leaves, don't touch the snow in your yard. A sensible part of me wanted to test it, to drag my boot through that perfect surface and laugh at myself. But another part, the quieter, older one, kept me still. I backed away slowly, my heart beating a little too fast, and closed the door behind me. That was the first day the neighbors started looking at my house differently. They didn't say anything, not at first. They just crossed the street when they passed or pretended to check their phones. Mrs. Keller next door waved once and then never again. The mail carrier began leaving packages at the gate instead of the porch. I told myself it was coincidence. Grief has a way of turning everything into a pattern if you let it. But the snow didn't melt. Not when the sun came out. Not when the rest of the street turned to sludge and then bare pavement. It stayed, pristine and silent, a white boundary I learned not to cross. At night, I dreamed of the grocery store, of fluorescent lights humming, of the older woman standing at the edge of my yard, her cart empty now, her eyes reflecting something I couldn't see. She never spoke in the dreams. She just waited. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through a quiet ending that changed everything, please leave a comment, and subscribe to Narrative Nest. I still remember the sound of the grocery store doors that night, the way they sighed open, letting in a breath of winter so sharp it made my eyes water. It was late December, the kind of evening where the cold felt personal, like it had followed you inside just to make a point. I was tired in the ordinary way: work, dinner plans, the mental list of things I'd forgotten at home. And I stood in line clutching a basket with soup, bread, and a box of tea I didn't really need. She was in front of me, an older woman, maybe late 60s, wrapped in a coat that had seen better winters. Her hair was pulled back tight, gray streaked with a yellowish white that reminded me of snow that's been walked on too much. She had a cart full of basics: canned beans, rice, a loaf of discount bread, powdered milk, the kind of groceries you buy when you're counting days as carefully as dollars. When the cashier announced the total, the woman nodded and slid a card forward. The machine beeped once, then again. The cashier tried a second time, her smile tightening like a knot pulled too hard. Declined. The woman didn't look surprised. She didn't argue or sigh. She just stared at the screen as if she'd already known how the conversation would end. I felt something move in my chest then. Not pity exactly, recognition. I've been fortunate most of my life, but I know the feeling of standing at a counter hoping the world doesn't notice you're about to come up short. Before I could overthink it, I stepped forward and said, "I've got it." The woman turned to look at me for the first time. Her eyes were sharp and oddly bright, like they reflected more than the fluorescent lights overhead. For a moment, I wondered if I'd offended her, but she said nothing, just nodded once as the cashier rang everything through again under my total. When I handed over my card, my hands were steady. It wasn't a huge amount. I remember thinking I'd feel good about it later, that I'd go home and tell my husband, and we'd both agree it was the right thing to do, the small kindness you're supposed to be proud of. As we walked toward the exit together, the automatic doors opening like a mouth exhaling frost, she finally spoke. Her voice was low and rough, like it had been scraped against silence for too long. "When your husband leaves, don't touch the snow in your yard." She didn't say thank you. She didn't even look at me when she said it. She just adjusted her coat, pushed her cart into the night parking lot, and disappeared into the dark parking lot where the lamps buzzed like tired insects. I stood there long after the doors closed, the sentence hanging in the air between the days after he left blurred together in a way I can only describe as quiet distortion. Time didn't stop, but it lost its edges. Morning light came and went without urgency, as if the sun itself wasn't sure it was still welcome. I went to work, answered emails, nodded at conversations, but everything felt like it was happening behind glass. The house, though, felt too present. Every sound carried. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a question being asked and left unanswered. Each morning, before I allowed myself coffee or a shower, I checked the front window. The snow remained untouched, smooth, white. Too white. It should have yellowed, thinned, collapsed under its own weight. Instead, it looked newly fallen, like it was being renewed overnight. On the third day, I noticed something else. The air above it shimmered faintly, the way heat does in summer, except this was cold, biting cold that stung my eyes if I stared too long. I told myself it was stress, lack of sleep, grief playing tricks on perception. I closed the curtains and went about my day. That afternoon, there was a knock at the door. I hadn't heard anyone approach, no crunch of boots, no footsteps, just the knock, soft but deliberate, like someone who knew I was listening. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The warning echoed in my head, uninvited but clear. Don't touch the snow. I opened the door just enough to see who it was. Mrs. Keller stood at the edge of the yard, not on the porch, not even on the walkway. She clutched her purse to her chest like a shield. "I brought soup," she called out, her voice too loud for the distance. "I thought you might need something warm." "That's kind of you," I said, though my throat felt tight. "You can leave it at the gate." She hesitated. Her eyes flicked to the snow between us, then back to my face. Something passed over her expression, fear, maybe, or relief that she hadn't stepped any closer. She set the container down carefully, as if placing it on an altar, and retreated without another word. After she left, I watched the yard for a long time. No footprints, no marks, just the untouched white and the gate standing open, as if inviting me to test it. I didn't. That night, the dream changed. The grocery store was gone. Instead, I stood in my front yard, barefoot, the cold biting into my skin. The older woman stood across from me, her coat open now, revealing nothing underneath but shadow. When she spoke, her voice came from everywhere at once. "You're holding. That's good. Most don't." "What happens if I don't?" I asked. She tilted her head. "You stay you." I woke with my heart racing and my hands clenched into fists so tight my nails had left half-moon marks in my palms. Over the next week, the neighborhood's distance grew more pronounced. Children stopped playing near my house. Delivery drivers refused to cross the yard, calling out apologies from the sidewalk. One afternoon, I overheard two women whispering as they passed. I caught only fragments. "Since he left," and "not right," and "that snow." I wanted to scream that I was still the same person, that I was grieving, not dangerous, but some instinct told me words wouldn't matter. Whatever line had been drawn wasn't just in the snow, it was in the way people felt when they looked at me. Loneliness settled in my bones, heavy, aching. I missed my husband in small, embarrassing ways, the way he hummed while making coffee, the crease between his eyebrows when he read. I missed having someone witness my days. At night, I lay in bed listening to the house breathe, wondering if this was what the snow was for, to keep the grief contained, to stop it from spilling out and swallowing everything else. The first time I saw an animal test the boundary, it was a deer. I was washing dishes when I noticed movement outside. A doe stood at the edge of the yard, her ears twitching. She lowered her head, sniffing the air. For a long moment, she seemed frozen, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Then she took one tentative step forward. The moment her hoof touched the snow, she recoiled violently, snorting and scrambling backward. She fled down the street, her panic contagious even from a distance. I stood there, my hands submerged in soapy water gone cold, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with winter. That evening, I sat on the couch and tried to remember the older woman's face clearly. I realized with a slow unease that I couldn't. I remembered her eyes, her voice, the weight of her words, but her features blurred when I tried to hold them still in my mind, like she was made of fog and intention rather than flesh. I began to research. Not openly at first. I didn't know what I was looking for, only that I needed context. I searched forums late at night, typing vague phrases about strange snow, about boundaries after loss. Most results were useless, grief blogs, superstition dismissed with cheerful skepticism. But buried deep in a thread that hadn't been updated in years, I found a comment that made my breath catch. After my husband left, there was a frost line around my property. Wouldn't melt. I broke it because I thought I was losing my mind. I wasn't. There was no follow-up, no explanation, just that. I slept poorly after that, waking to every sound. The dreams returned with new urgency. Now the woman stood closer each time, her feet just at the edge of the snow. Behind her, shapes moved. Not people exactly, memories maybe, moments given form. I recognized flashes of my own life in them, my wedding day, an argument I thought we'd resolved, the look on my husband's face when he said he needed space. "Why me?" I asked her in one dream, my voice breaking. She looked at me with something like pity. "You paid attention. You listened when it would have been easier not to." I woke with tears soaking the pillow, the weight of that answer pressing on my chest. On the 10th day, there was another knock, louder this time, insistent. It was my sister. She stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, her jaw set in the way I recognized from childhood. "You can't just shut everyone out," she said without greeting. "People are worried." "I'm not shutting anyone out," I replied. "I'm protecting something." She followed my gaze to the yard. Her expression shifted, confusion giving way to unease. "It's just snow," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "You're letting this, whatever it is, get to you." "Please," I said softly, "just don't come any closer." She stared at me for a long moment, then shook her head. "I don't like this. You need help." Maybe she was right, but as she turned to leave, I saw her hesitate, her foot hovering just above the snow before she pulled back. Even she felt it. The line, the warning. That night, as I sat alone with the house wrapped in silence, I realized the truth settling into me as a second spine. The snow wasn't punishing me. It was holding the space my marriage had vacated, containing the weight of what I hadn't yet faced. And I didn't know how long I could keep holding it back. By the second week, the snow felt less like something outside my house and more like something inside me, a pressure I carried from room to room. I learned the exact angle of the sun in the mornings, the way its light hit the white surface and bounced back too brightly, forcing me to squint. I learned how sound behaved near it, how voices seemed to flatten, how even the wind quieted as it passed over the yard, as if unwilling to disturb what had been set in place. I stopped trying to explain it to myself. Explanations belonged to the world beyond the gate, the world that still functioned on cause and effect. Inside the boundary, things followed a different logic, or maybe they always had, and I'd only just noticed. The first letter arrived without a stamp. I found it resting against the inside of the gate one morning, the envelope plain and unmarked, my name written in a careful, slanted hand I didn't recognize, but somehow knew. I hadn't heard the gate open. I hadn't heard footsteps. It was simply there, waiting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "You're doing well," it read. "Grief, respect, patience. It punishes curiosity." No signature, no date. I stood there for a long time, the cold seeping through my coat, and thought about all the times I'd been curious when I should have been still, all the conversations I'd pushed for answers in, all the moments I'd dug at wounds that weren't ready to close. The letter felt less like a threat and more like an assessment, as if something unseen was watching how I behaved with what I'd been given. The house began to change subtly after that. Rooms felt larger on the inside than they should have. The hallways stretched a little longer each night. Mirrors reflected me a half second too late. When I walked past my husband's empty chair at the table, I sometimes caught a warmth there, like someone had just stood up. I stopped sitting in that spot. Some things are easier to leave untouched. The neighbors' avoidance turned into something like ritual. They moved around my property with intention, wide arcs that left my house standing in a bubble of quiet. No one rang the doorbell anymore. No one waved. I became a landmark rather than a person, the house with the snow, the woman whose husband left. I didn't blame them. On some level, I understood. The snow wasn't just protecting me from something, it was protecting them too. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry, I heard a sound that didn't belong, a low humming just at the edge of hearing. It wasn't coming from the street or the house, it was coming from the yard. I approached the window slowly, my heart thudding in my ears. The snow rippled, not melting, not shifting with wind, rippling like a breath drawn and released. The surface undulated gently, and with each movement, images flickered beneath it. Faces, scenes, a woman kneeling on a bathroom floor, her wedding ring clutched in her fist. Another standing in a doorway watching a car disappear down a long road. Another sitting very still at a kitchen table that looked a lot like mine. I stumbled back, pressing my hand to my mouth to keep from crying out. My reflection in the glass looked pale, eyes too bright. I knew then that the snow wasn't empty, it was full, layered with stories that hadn't been allowed to finish. That night, the older woman came to me while I was awake. I was sitting on the couch, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, when I felt the air in the room thicken. The lights dimmed, not flickering out, but softening like the world was lowering its voice. She stood near the front door, just inside the threshold, her outline sharp against the dark. "You shouldn't be here," I whispered. She smiled, a small, sad curve of the lips. "I never cross," she said. "You know that." "What is this?" I asked, my voice shaking, despite my effort to keep it steady. "What did you give me?" She moved closer, stopping just short of where the snow would have been if it extended inside. "I didn't give you anything. You accepted it." I thought of the grocery store, the moment I'd stepped forward without thinking, the way her eyes had searched mine as if measuring something. "Why me?" I asked again, though I already suspected the answer. "Because you saw me," she said simply. "Not my need, me." She told me then what the snow was, not in a lecture or a warning, but in pieces, the way truth is usually handed down. She spoke of women who were left in ways that hollowed them out, of grief that, when uncontained, seeped into everything, children, homes, entire streets, of how long ago something had learned to gather that grief, to hold it at the threshold until the woman was ready to decide what to do with it. The snow is a pause, she said, a mercy. It keeps the worst of it from walking straight in. And if I touch it? I asked. Her eyes darkened. Then you tell it you're ready to be done waiting. She didn't have to explain what it was. I'd seen the shapes beneath the surface, felt the pull in my dreams. The thing that fed of abandonment, that wore memories like borrowed skin. Most women, she continued, can't stand the stillness. They want answers, closure. They break the boundary to feel something solid again. And what happens to them? I asked. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was very quiet. They become stories other women warn each other about. I thought of the letter, of the forum post, of the way people cross the street to avoid my house, a lineage of warnings passed from hand to hand, moment to moment, as subtle as a sentence in a grocery store. Why help me? I asked. She looked at me for a long time. Because no one helped me, and because kindness should be returned honestly. When she was gone, the room felt emptier than before. I sat there until dawn, listening to the house, thinking about the choice she said I would have to make. Preserve the snow and remain in this suspended state, protected but isolated, or break it and face whatever waited on the other side. On the 14th morning, my husband called. His name lit up my phone like a ghost. I stared at it until it stopped ringing. A voicemail followed, then another. I didn't listen to them. I didn't need. By the second week, the snow felt less like something outside my house and more like something inside me, a pressure I carried from room to room. I learned the exact angle of the sun in the mornings, the way its light hit the white surface and bounced back too brightly, forcing me to squint. I learned how sound behaved near it, how voices seemed to flatten, how even the wind quieted as it passed over the yard, as if unwilling to disturb what had been set in place. I stopped trying to explain it to myself. Explanations belonged to the world beyond the gate, the world that still functioned on cause and effect. Inside the boundary, things followed a different logic, or maybe they always had, and I'd only just noticed. The first letter arrived without a stamp. I found it resting against the inside of the gate one morning, the envelope plain and unmarked, my name written in a careful, slanted hand I didn't recognize, but somehow knew. I hadn't heard the gate open. I hadn't heard footsteps. It was simply there, waiting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "You're doing well," it read. "Grief, respect, patience. It punishes curiosity." No signature. No date. I stood there for a long time, the cold seeping through my coat, and thought about all the times I'd been curious when I should have been still, all the conversations I'd pushed for answers in, all the moments I dug at wounds that weren't ready to close. The letter felt less like a threat and more like an assessment, as if something unseen was watching how I behaved with what I'd been given. The house began to change subtly after that. Rooms felt larger on the inside than they should have. The hallways stretched a little longer each night. Mirrors reflected me a half second too late. When I walked past my husband's empty chair at the table, I sometimes caught a warmth there, like someone had just stood up. I stopped sitting in that spot. Some things are easier to leave untouched. The neighbors' avoidance turned into something like ritual. They moved around my property with intention, wide arcs that left my house standing in a bubble of quiet. No one rang the doorbell anymore. No one waved. I became a landmark rather than a person. the house with the snow, the woman whose husband left. I didn't blame them. On some level, I understood. The snow wasn't just protecting me from something, it was protecting them too. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry, I heard a sound that didn't belong, a low humming just at the edge of hearing. It wasn't coming from the street or the house, it was coming from the yard. I approached the window slowly, my heart thudding in my ears. The snow rippled, not melting, not shifting with wind, rippling like a breath drawn and released. The surface undulated gently, and with each movement, images flickered beneath it. Faces, scenes, a woman kneeling on a bathroom floor, her wedding ring clutched in her fist. Another standing in a doorway watching a car disappear down a long road. Another. I didn't touch the snow that day. Wanting and doing are different muscles, and mine were still learning how to hold tension without tearing. I let the phone ring again in the afternoon, then turned it face down on the counter like I'd seen my husband do so many times before. The symmetry of it made me flinch. Grief has a cruel sense of humor. Instead, I cleaned, not in a frantic way, but deliberately, as if each wiped surface was proof that I still existed in solid form. I folded his remaining shirts and placed them in a box, sealing it with tape I pressed down harder than necessary. When I carried the box to the hallway closet, the space seemed to resist it, like the house itself didn't want reminders stored away. I forced the door shut anyway. That evening, I finally listened to the first voicemail. His voice sounded older, thinner. He spoke my name like he was testing whether it still belonged to him. He said he hadn't planned to call so soon, that he just wanted to check in, that he hoped I was okay. There were pauses where he waited for an answer that wasn't coming. I deleted the message before it finished. The snow outside reacted. I didn't see it happen, but I felt it, a tightening, a subtle hum beneath my feet. The house creaked softly like a warning whispered through wood and nails. I closed my eyes and breathed until the sensation passed. That night, the dreams turned sharper. I stood at the edge of the yard again, but this time the boundary was thinner, translucent like ice over dark water. Beneath it, the shapes pressed closer. One of them wore my husband's face, though his eyes were wrong, too empty, too hungry. He reached out, his hand stopping just short of breaking through. "Just step in," he said. "You deserve answers." I woke with a scream caught in my throat, my heart hammering like it wanted out. For a long time, I lay there listening to my own breathing, reminding myself that the bed was solid, that the walls were real. In the morning, I found another letter. This one was different. The handwriting was shakier, the ink darker, as if pressed into the page with urgency. "He will try to come back, not to you, to the space you're holding. Be careful what you let speak to you." I crumpled the paper in my fist and pressed it to my chest. A realization settled over me with slow, awful clarity. The thing beneath the snow wasn't limited to my memories. It could wear any shape that might convince me to cross willingly. Comfort was just another language it spoke fluently. By the third week, the calls increased. Texts followed. My husband's number alternated with unknown ones. Sometimes there was nothing on the line but breathing. Sometimes there were fragments of sentences, distorted and wrong, like someone practicing being human. "I miss you. I'm cold. Why won't you open the door?" I stopped answering altogether. The neighborhood reacted in ways both subtle and overt. Someone taped a pamphlet to my gate about grief counseling. Another left a note asking me to clear the snow because it was affecting property values. I tore that one up without guilt. They didn't understand what I was protecting them from. One afternoon, I heard shouting. A man stood at the edge of my yard, his face red, his posture aggressive. I didn't recognize him, but he pointed at the snow like it had personally offended him. "You can't leave this like this. It's unnatural." I stayed inside, watching through the glass. He took a step forward, his boot hovering over the white surface. For a moment, I thought he would do it, that he would break the boundary himself. The air changed instantly. A pressure wave rolled outward, flattening sound, bending light. The man staggered back, clutching his head as if struck. He screamed, not in pain, but in terror, and ran, not looking back once. The snow settled again, smooth as ever. I sank to the floor, shaking. The line wasn't just for me anymore. It was active, a living decision being reinforced moment by moment. That night, the older woman returned. She looked more tired than before, her shoulders bowed as if she carried weight I couldn't see. "It's getting stronger," she said without preamble. "How long can this last?" I asked. My voice sounded small to my own ears. She sat heavily in a chair, her gaze fixed on the front door. "As long as you need, or until you choose otherwise." "And you?" I asked. "What happened to you?" She smiled sadly. "I touched the snow." The words landed like a dropped plate, shattering something fragile inside me. "But you're still here." "In pieces," she said. "Enough to warn, not enough to stay." She told me her story then, haltingly. A husband who left abruptly, children grown and distant, a house too full of echoes. She'd broken the boundary within days, desperate to feel something that wasn't waiting. What came through wore her husband's kindness first, then her own voice, then nothing she recognized at all. "It feeds until there's nothing left but the warning. That's what I am now." Tears streamed down my face, hot and unstoppable. "I don't want that," I whispered. "Then don't rush," she said gently. "Grief doesn't expire. It changes." After she vanished, I sat with the truth of it, that my husband's absence had created a hollow large enough to attract something ancient and patient, that the snow was not punishment, but protection bought with stillness and restraint. The next morning, my sister returned. She didn't shout this time. She didn't argue. She stood quietly at the gate, her eyes rimmed red. "I had a dream about you," she said softly. "You were standing in the snow, and I couldn't reach you." I swallowed hard. "I'm still here." She nodded, relief and fear warring on her face. "Then stay," she said, "however you need to." For the first time since my husband left, I felt something like peace. Not happiness, not resolution, but a groundedness that let me breathe without bracing for the next blow. I realized then that the final choice wasn't about destruction or preservation. It was about timing, about knowing when grief had taught me what it came to teach. The snow glowed softly outside, patient as ever, and I knew the question would come again. Just not yet. Time inside the boundary began to move differently, not faster or slower exactly, just deeper. Days layered on top of each other like sediment, each one leaving a thin impression before settling into stillness. I stopped counting how long my husband had been gone. I stopped marking anniversaries of absence. The snow didn't care for numbers, and slowly, neither did I. I learned how to live without crossing the line. Mornings became quiet rituals. I brewed coffee and drank it by the window, watching the way steam curled upward and vanished. I read books I'd once abandoned halfway through, discovering that stories felt different now, less like escape, more like companionship. I spoke aloud to the house sometimes, narrating small tasks just to hear a human voice. The walls seemed to listen. They didn't answer, but they held the sound gently, like they understood the need. The dreams continued, but they shifted. The thing beneath the snow no longer wore my husband's face. It tried others instead. Old friends I'd lost touch with, versions of myself from years ago, lighter, hopeful, unbroken. Each time it offered the same thing in different words: relief, movement, an end to waiting. You don't have to be strong anymore. Come back to yourself. Let me carry it for you. Each time I woke with the same steady refusal settling in my chest. Not yet. One afternoon I noticed cracks forming, not in the snow, but around it, fine lines etched into the air like stress fractures in glass. They shimmered faintly, visible only when the light hit just right. I understood instinctively what they meant. The boundary wasn't infinite. It was never meant to be permanent. That knowledge didn't frighten me the way it once might have. It felt fair. The letters stopped coming. In their place came memories, uninvited, vivid, relentless. I'd be washing a cup and suddenly feel the weight of my wedding dress again, hear the laughter I'd thought was permanent. I'd be brushing my teeth and see the exact moment I'd noticed my husband pulling away, the way his eyes slid past me instead of landing. The snow pulsed gently each time, absorbing the emotional surge like a lung drawing in smoke. One evening I stood at the gate and spoke out loud, my voice trembling but clear. I know you're there. The air thickened. The snow darkened slightly, as if shadow passed beneath it. I'm not ready, but I will be, I said. The pressure eased. For the first time, I sensed something like acknowledgement. Weeks passed. The neighborhood began to adjust to my presence again, cautiously. Mrs. Keller waved once more from a distance. A child rode his bike past my house without swerving away. Life bent slowly around the boundary rather than breaking against it. Then came the night when everything went quiet. No wind, no hum, no pulsing beneath my feet. The snow lay dull and flat, its glow gone. I woke with a heaviness in my chest that felt different from grief. Urgent, expectant. The front door rattled. Not a knock, not a gentle test, a deliberate pull, as if someone on the other side believed they had the right to enter. I stood frozen in the hallway, every instinct screaming at once. My love, a voice called softly. My husband's voice, perfect, warm. Please. I backed away, shaking my head. You're not him. A sigh. I can be, if you let me. The snow surged, a wave pressing against the house. Pictures fell from the walls. The lights flickered violently. I realized then that waiting was no longer enough. The thing had grown impatient, or maybe it sensed that I was changing. I thought of the older woman, of what she'd lost, of what she'd become. I thought of the grocery store, of the moment kindness had crossed an invisible threshold. I stepped toward the door. Stop, the voice warned, its tone sharpening. You don't know what you'll lose. I know what I've already lost, I said. I opened the door. Cold air rushed in, sharp and alive. The snow roared, no longer silent, no longer still. Images burst upward, memories, grief, anger, love, colliding in a blinding storm. I stepped forward, my foot sinking into the white for the first time. Pain flared, immediate and raw, like every goodbye I'd swallowed burning its way out at once. I screamed, not in fear, but release. Words poured from me, things I'd never said, accusations, forgiveness, truth. The thing howled, its many voices unraveling. I didn't cross completely. I didn't retreat either. I stood at the edge, letting the storm pass through me instead of around me, letting it take what it had been waiting for without letting it take me. When the snow finally collapsed, it melted fast, soaking into the ground like it had never been there at all. I fell to my knees, exhausted, empty, and indisputably myself. In the distance, I thought I heard a soft laugh, grateful, free. By morning, the yard was bare. The boundary was gone. But so was the hunger. The morning after the snow vanished, the world felt louder. Birds argued in the trees. A car backfired down the street. Somewhere, a lawn sprinkler sputtered to life, absurd and ordinary. I sat on the front steps, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the dark, wet ground where the boundary had been, half expecting it to surge back into shape if I blinked too long. It didn't. The yard looked smaller without it, ordinary, vulnerable, and so did I. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel healed. What I felt was exposed, like a scab torn away before new skin had fully formed. Everything touched sharper now. Memories, sounds, even my own thoughts. But beneath that rawness was something steadier, a sense that I was standing in my life again instead of beside it. Neighbors began to approach that day, tentatively at first. Mrs. Keller crossed the yard, her shoes sinking into the damp earth. She brought bread, still warm, and touched my arm gently as if to confirm I was solid. Others followed over the next few days with casseroles, awkward smiles, apologies they didn't quite know how to voice. I accepted them all, not because I needed the food, but because accepting felt like practice for staying present. At night, I slept without dreaming. That absence startled me more than the nightmares ever had. I lay awake listening to the house, waiting for the hum beneath the floorboards, the pressure in the air. Nothing came, just the steady tick of the clock and my own breathing. I realized how long it had been since silence felt neutral instead of threatening. On the fourth day, I found myself standing in the grocery store again. The same one. Same fluorescent lights, same hum. I hadn't planned it. My feet had simply carried me there, drawn by something unfinished. I stood in the checkout line with a basket of mundane things, milk, fruit, a bar of soap, and scanned the faces ahead of me. I half expected to see her. She wasn't there. For a moment, disappointment pricked at me, sharp and irrational. I wanted confirmation that it had all been real, that I hadn't imagined the boundary or the warnings or the cost of kindness freely given. As I paid and turned to leave, I noticed a young woman behind me. Her cart was small, her coat thin. She looked tired in the way people do when they're holding too many worries too close to the surface. When the cashier announced her total, she flinched before sliding her card forward. It declined. The sound sliced through me with uncanny familiarity. The woman's shoulders sagged, embarrassment flooding her face. She opened her mouth to apologize, to explain, to shrink herself. I felt the moment stretch. I thought of the older woman, of what she had carried, of what she had passed on. And I understood then that the boundary wasn't gone. It had changed shape. "I've got it," I said, stepping forward. The young woman turned to me, startled. Her eyes met mine, and for a split second something passed between us, recognition maybe, or relief. I paid without ceremony, without hesitation. Outside, the cold bit gently at my cheeks. The woman thanked me, her voice thick with emotion. She started to walk away, then hesitated. "I don't know why, but I feel like I should tell you. I just left my husband." The words landed softly, not like a prophecy, like a confession. I met her gaze and chose my response carefully. "Be patient with yourself and listen when things go quiet." She nodded, though I wasn't sure she understood. She didn't need to. Not yet. I walked home through streets that felt newly mine. When I reached my house, I paused at the edge of the yard, instinctively searching for the line that no longer showed itself. The ground was firm beneath my feet, cold, real. Inside, the house greeted me without echo or resistance. I set my groceries down and stood in the kitchen, breathing, letting the ordinariness settle around me. Grief was still there. It would be for a long time, but it no longer pressed at the door, demanding shape and voice. That night, as I turned out the lights, I thought I saw a reflection in the darkened window, an older woman, smiling faintly, her outline thinning like mist. "Thank you," I whispered. The glass showed only my own face staring back. I knew then that some warnings are not meant to scare us away from living, but to teach us how to stay when everything inside wants to flee. That abandonment does not have to hollow us out. That patience, painful as it is, can be a form of power. I slept deeply for the first time in months, and when I woke, the day waited for me, unguarded. Life didn't return to normal. I learned quickly that normal is something you outgrow the moment it abandons you. What came instead was quieter, less dramatic, but more honest. Days unfolded without omens, nights passed without visitations, and yet I carried the awareness with me like a scar you only notice when the weather changes. I began therapy, not because anyone pushed me to, but because I wanted a place where words could land without consequence. I spoke about my marriage in pieces, testing each memory aloud to see if it still belonged to me. Some did, some didn't. My therapist never rushed me, never tried to stitch meaning where it wasn't ready. In that room, I learned that grief doesn't need to be solved, it needs to be witnessed. My husband stopped calling. I noticed the absence one afternoon when I realized I hadn't checked my phone in hours. The relief that followed surprised me. Not joy, not triumph. Relief like setting down a bag you hadn't realized was digging into your shoulder. I wished him well in the abstract, way you wish good weather on a place you no longer live. The house adjusted, slowly. I moved furniture, painted walls, opened windows even when it was cold just to remind myself I could. The front yard stayed bare, grass stubbornly pushing through soil that had held something impossible not long ago. Sometimes I stood there barefoot, grounding myself in the undeniable truth of the present. People began to talk to me again, not about the snow, never about the snow. They asked about work, about books I was reading, about whether I'd considered getting a dog. I answered politely, grateful for the ordinary shapes of conversation. Still, I noticed how some women lingered when they spoke to me, how their eyes searched my face like they were hoping to find something unspoken there. I didn't volunteer warnings. I understood now why the older woman hadn't explained everything in the store. Truth delivered too early sounds like madness. Some lessons only open when pain turns the key. The dreams returned once, months later. I stood in the grocery store again, but this time I was alone. The aisles stretched longer than they should have, vanishing into shadow. At the far end, I saw a patch of white on the floor. Snow, untouched, waiting. I woke before I reached it, my heart steady, my breath calm. The dream didn't feel like a threat, it felt like a reminder. That winter, the snow came back the way it always had, messy, temporary, easily ruined by footprints and plows. I shoveled my yard without hesitation, laughing once when I slipped and landed hard on my side. The cold stung, but it was clean pain, honest pain. On a quiet evening near the end of January, my sister came over for dinner. We ate soup at the kitchen table, steam fogging the windows. She talked about work, about things that didn't matter much, and I listened with genuine attention. At one point, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You're different," she said gently. "I know," I replied. "Better?" she asked, careful. I considered it. "Truer," I said finally. She smiled, satisfied with that answer. Later that night, after she left, I stood by the front window and looked out at the street. A woman I didn't recognize stood across the way, staring at my house. She wasn't threatening, she wasn't afraid, she just looked lost. For a moment, she turned and walked on. I understood then that the boundary doesn't always appear as snow. Sometimes it's a pause before answering a text. Sometimes it's staying silent when the urge to explain burns your tongue. Sometimes it's choosing not to reach back for someone who already let go. I thought again of the older woman, of her tired eyes, of the way she'd carried her warning like a final gift. I hoped, wherever she was now, that she felt lighter, that she knew her kindness had not ended with her. Before bed, I wrote in a notebook I'd kept since the night the snow vanished. I didn't journal my feelings. I wrote truths, short sentences, anchors. I am allowed to wait. I am allowed to change. Not every ending is an invitation to disappear. As I closed the notebook, a strange certainty settled over me. The story wasn't finished. Not fully. There was still one final reckoning left, not with the thing that had fed on grief, but with the part of me that had learned to survive by shrinking. That kind of confrontation doesn't come with storms or signs. It comes quietly, and it comes last. The final reckoning didn't announce itself. There was no dream, no letter, no pressure in the air. It arrived on an afternoon so ordinary I almost missed it, wrapped in sunlight and the low hum of a passing car. I was in the attic, sorting through boxes I'd avoided since my husband left, not because they hurt exactly, but because they belonged to a version of me that had learned to stay small in order to keep peace. Old photos, cards, a set of dishes we'd received as a wedding gift and never used because they were too nice for every day. I laughed softly at that. Too nice for a life that had turned out to be temporary. At the bottom of one box, I found a scarf I didn't recognize at first. Gray wool, soft, worn thin at the edges. When I lifted it, a faint smell of winter clung to it, cold air and something metallic, like memory itself. My hands stilled. I knew whose it was. The older woman. I sat down hard on the attic floor, the boards creaking beneath me. I couldn't remember taking the scarf, couldn't remember her giving it to me, but there it was, undeniable as the snow had once been. I wrapped it around my fingers, and the house seemed to lean in, listening. "You're still here," I whispered. The air shifted, gentle as a breath. And for the first time, I understood the final shape of the inheritance she'd left me. She hadn't passed on the snow, she'd passed on the knowing, the ability to recognize the moment when grief becomes a doorway instead of a wound, the courage to pause instead of rushing toward the familiar pain of abandonment, the responsibility to hold space without being consumed by it. I carried the scarf downstairs and opened the front door. The afternoon was mild, the yard green and unremarkable. I stepped onto the grass and let the scarf slip from my hands. The ground accepted it. No ripple, no surge, no hunger answering back. I felt something loosen inside me then, something I hadn't realized I was still holding, the need to be vigilant, to guard against what might come if I ever stopped paying attention. I realized that the boundary had never been about fear, it had been about respect, for grief, for self, for timing. That evening, I cooked a real meal for myself. Nothing elaborate, just food made with care. I ate at the table without distraction, tasting each bite. When I finished, I didn't rush to clean up. I sat there, hands folded, letting the quiet settle. For the first time since my husband left, the quiet felt complete. Weeks later, I ran into him by chance. A coffee shop, mid-morning. He looked startled to see me, like he'd assumed I existed only in the places he wasn't. We exchanged polite words. He asked how I was. I answered honestly. "I'm well," I said. The words surprised both of us. He hesitated, then said, "I'm sorry for how I left." I studied his face, really studied it, and felt no pull toward the past, no urge to open old doors, just a calm acknowledgement of what had been and what was no longer mine to carry. "I know," I said. "Take care." When I walked away, there was no echo, no shadow following me out the door. That night, I dreamed one last time. I stood at the edge of a yard, not mine, not anyone's in particular. Snow lay untouched before me, pristine and bright. Beside me stood the older woman, her posture straighter than I'd ever seen it. "You'll need me no more," she said, her voice warm. "Will anyone?" I asked. She smiled. "Only until they learn to listen." She stepped into the snow, and instead of swallowing her, it dissolved beneath her feet, turning to light. When I woke, my cheeks were wet with tears that felt more like gratitude than sorrow. Spring came gently that year. I planted flowers in the front yard, kneeling in the dirt, my hands stained with soil and life. Neighbors stopped to chat. Children ran past, careless and loud. The world resumed its ordinary risks, and I met them without flinching. Sometimes in the grocery store, I notice women standing very still in line, their faces tight with the effort of holding something together. Sometimes I help. Sometimes I don't. Kindness, I've learned, isn't about saving. It's about recognizing when someone is ready to receive. I never say the words she said to me, not exactly. But once, not long ago, I paid for a woman's groceries. Outside, she thanked me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She told me her husband had moved out the night before. I touched her arm gently and said, "Be patient with the quiet. It's doing more work than you think." She nodded, even though she didn't fully understand. She would. Or she wouldn't. Either way, the choice would be hers. That's the moral I carry now, the one I live by. Abandonment can hollow you out, or it can carve space for something truer to grow. Grief can devour you, or it can teach you to stand still enough to survive yourself. And sometimes the greatest kindness is not crossing a line before you're ready. The snow never returned to my yard in that other way, but the lesson stayed, and it always will.